I think there's somebody who's not muted.
Sorry, yeah, are we muted?
No, well, I'm muted.
No, but yeah, somebody's not muted.
Just when you move that wire.
It's there. It's definitely there. It's them, it's not us. Because they've all got...
Right, I've unmuted myself. I became muted, so you couldn't hear me. I've now unmuted myself again. So Willy is married to my wife's cousin, Marilyn. And in our family, when somebody marries in and is a cousin, we consider them a full cousin. So I refer to Willy as my cousin. This photo was taken last September in Willy's flat in Toronto, in a room that is turned into his artist studio. And Willy, in that photo, was 86. And Willy and Marilyn and my wife Anne and myself are great friends. Apart from being cousins, we are great friends. We see them a lot. We've been on holiday with them. They've been to our house. We've been to their house. And the story that I'm going to tell you started in 2011 when Marilyn and Willy were staying in our house, and Willy started talking about his childhood. Now, I always knew that Willy was born in France, and I knew how old he was, but I didn't really know about Willy's life during the war and the life and story of his family. And Willy started to tell us that he forced himself to forget what happened during the war because it was so upsetting and traumatic. But now that he's getting older, he feels that he owes it to his two sons to tell them the story so that they know what happened to a large family that no longer exists that was murdered during the Holocaust. So we were chatting and stories. The story of Willy as a 9-year-old boy, a 9-year-old Jewish boy living in Belgium during the Second World War. The story of that 9-year-old boy when he was in his 80s, trying to remember what happened to him during the war. And my story, accompanying Willy on the research and his journey in finding out what happened to his family in the war. But before I tell you that story, I think it's helpful to put Willy's story in an historical background. On May the 10th, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Belgium, and it took only 18 days to put the country under military rule. And that lasted until the liberation by the Allies in September 1944. This map shows the German domination of Europe in 1942. So in red are the countries that the German Reich occupied. In the pink countries, it was countries who were allies or dependent states of the Nazis. And there's neutral and allies. So you can see that Nazi domination of Europe was massive. And 1942 is an important date in Willy's story. So when the Nazis invaded Belgium, what did it mean for the 70,000 Jews who were living there? Well, most were foreign Jews who recently arrived and were stateless refugees who themselves were fleeing from the Nazis. And it was not good news that the Nazis had invaded Belgium. Of those 70,000 Jews, 25,000 Jews were deported, and most were murdered in the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. Of the 25,000 who were deported, only 2,000 survived. Some avoided deportation by hiding, and Willy was one of these. The German occupation of Belgium meant life changed dramatically for Belgian Jews. And one of the things that really shocked me in the information that I found out when I did the research with Willy was how the Belgian civil service cooperated with the German military administration. They cooperated and they collaborated. And this is a poster on the right of the screen that was put up in Brussels. And it's in French, and it is signed by the mayor of Brussels. And it shows clear collaboration between the local government and the Nazis. And this notice tells the Jewish population that they have to take their ID cards, go to the town hall, to the civic centre, and register themselves as Jews and have Jew stamped on their ID card. The Germans introduced anti-Jewish laws that restricted the civil rights of Jews. On the top right-hand side of this screen, you'll see a sign that any Jewish shop, any Jewish business, any Jewish cafe had to put up in their shop that said it's a Jewish establishment. Jewish property and businesses were confiscated. Kosher meat production was banned. Jews were banned from many professions. And in 1942, Jews were required to wear the yellow Star of David. And you can see a boy, this isn't Willy, wearing the Star of David. And this was meant to be a badge of shame, so that when Jews walked down the street, they could be picked on, they could be banned from going into shops. At schools, it meant that the teachers would not ask Jewish children questions, and Jewish children couldn't ask questions. They were bullied, and this was a dreadful thing they had to do. The other aspect is that Jews were rounded up for forced labor. Now, what was going on in Belgium was known to the outside world. And this is a bulletin from the JTA, a daily news bulletin in New York. And it was published on Thursday, September the 18th, 1941. And I'll read out what it says on the screen. Nazis imposed curfew upon Brussels Jews. And it was written from Stockholm. Jews in Brussels may not leave their homes between the hours of 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. under a new order issued by the German military commander of the city. It is reported in the Brüsseler Zeitung, reaching here today. Traveling elsewhere than within the area of Brussels, Antwerp, Liège, and Charleroi is also forbidden to Jews. These measures have been taken because Jews have been abusing the liberty they have enjoyed, the Nazi-controlled Belgian paper states. So I've given you an idea of what the environment and what life was like for the Jewish population of Belgium. Let's now turn to Willy's story. So I mentioned before that in 2011, Willy decided to start researching his wartime history. Because like many other survivors, in order to survive, Willy shut off his past. And he told me, if I thought about the past, I couldn't move forward. And Willy decided to write this story for his two sons. So there we were in our house, and we were sitting in front of the computer. And I said to Willy, well, let's make a start. Let's put your birthday here. And let's put today's date here. And let's see what we can fill out. So Willy told me that he was walking in 1942. He was walking with his dad in Antwerp, and there was a roundup of Jewish men and women in the street. And as the SS came for Willy's dad, then Willy's dad pushed Willy to a non-Jewish member of the resistance that Willy's dad knew. And Willy's dad said to Willy, "Go with your father." So this man took Willy by the hand, told him not to look back, and took him away. And Willy told me that he was taken away, and I'll tell you more details of that. And he was given the name of Willy van Hammer. And I said to him, "Well, that's interesting that you kept the name Willy." And he said, "No, actually, my name was Akiba." And Willy showed us this photo, which is the only photo he had of his family. And that's Willy in the center, and it's his mum and dad and an aunt and his two sisters. And this was taken in Antwerp before the war. And until our research trip to Belgium, this was the only photo Willy had of his parents. Willy told us that his family moved from France to Antwerp in 1936, looking for better business opportunities. And he explained that his dad was taken away, and he was taken to a scary place with dragons, where he was met by a Catholic priest. And as I mentioned before, he was given the name of Willy van Hammer. And I explained that Willy said that his real name is Akiba, and I didn't know that. I didn't know his real name was Akiba Halpert. So this was upsetting enough for Willy at that point, and he went away. And I typed in Akiba Halpert into Google search, and this was the beginning of my research. And it took me to the Yad Vashem website, where it had Willy's name, and I've listed Willy and his three sisters, who all went into hiding, and they were on a list of hidden children. And this list was compiled by a most wonderful person called Andre Gerlin Herzevici. And that is a photograph of Andre Gerlin Herzevici taken during the war. And you can see behind her, there are German officers. Andre Gerlin Herzevici was a 20-year-old school teacher. She was Catholic. And together with about 12 mostly non-Jewish people, helped save several thousand Jewish children. We'll come back to Andre Gerlin's story later. Here is a list of a page of Andre Gerlin's book. And you can see about halfway down, it says Akiba and Halpert, and that is the list with Willy's name. I call him Willy, I don't call him Akiba. Willy's name and his sisters. And we discovered the most incredible plan that Andre Gerlin Herzevici and her partners in the resistance did. They saved several thousand Jewish children, and they did it by hiding them and having the records of where they were hidden put in different places. So there was one book, this book, that had the real names, date of births and details of the hidden children. There's another book that has their names together with a number. Each child had their own separate number. In another book, there was this number and the name they were given, their false name. And for Willy, it was Willy van Hammer. In another book, there was a list of all the places that children were hidden, and each place was given a number. And there was another book that had the child's number next to the number of the location that they were hidden. And each of these books were hidden in a different place. And nobody in this resistance team knew where all the books were. So if one of them were to be caught, they couldn't give the information that would lead to the capture of all of the hidden children. Quite a remarkable thing. And these books have survived, and they're now in the Yad Vashem archives. So there we were at our house, and we'd seen this information on the screen, and Marilyn and Willy's visit with us stopped, and Marilyn and Willy went back to Canada, and we carried on our lives, and we carried on trying to do research to find out as much as we could about Willy's family and what happened to them and what happened to him and where he was hidden, because he didn't know where he was hidden. And Marilyn managed to find two brothers in the United States who were also hidden children. She found them by searching on the internet, and it turns out they were hidden in the same place that Willy was. And so they told him where that was. But there were lots of gaps that needed filling in. So in 2014, Willy and I went on a 2-week trip to Belgium. And here are some photos of the many archives and museums we went to. And one of the places we visited was the Jewish Museum in Brussels, where we carried out research and saw very interesting documents. Tragically, a couple of weeks after our visit, there was an anti-Semitic terrorist attack on the 24th of May 2014, where a gunman opened fire at the Jewish Museum in Brussels, killing 4 people. This person was subsequently caught and arrested for the shooting. And it was very chilling that anti-Semitic attacks that kill Jewish people, sadly, are still going on. But let's go back to that dreadful day when Willy's father was arrested. It was August the 28th, 1942. It was the 7th large Jewish roundup. Willy's father was arrested. Willy was taken into hiding, but he didn't know where. So after Willy's dad was taken away, and this man took Willy by the hand and told him to don't look back, he took Willy, and he was 9 years old, remember? He put him in the back of a van on his own, where he sat for a couple of hours, bouncing around in the back of this van, where he was taken somewhere where there were scary dragons. That's what he remembers. And we found out from these 2 brothers in the United States that Willy went on a 75-mile journey from Antwerp to a chateau, Chateau de Belloy. And there is a picture of Willy as we arrived, and he pointed to me and he said, "These are the scary dragons that I remember." Now, the Chateau de Belloy is the most beautiful place. It's, you know, we would call it a stately home. It's open for members of the public to come and visit. And when Willy contacted the chateau, explaining why he wanted to come and visit, he found out that it's, although it's open to the public, it's lived in by a prince, the Prince de Ligne and his family. And when this prince heard that somebody who was a hidden child in this castle during the war was coming, he wanted to meet us. And the first thing he said to Willy is, "Welcome home. This was your home before it was mine." We were shown some fascinating documents that records what life was like for the children during the war that were hidden in the chateau. Now, let me explain how it came about that quite a lot of children were hidden in this chateau during the war. The prince's grandfather, who was the prince at the time, and his family were very generous. You know, they inherited this beautiful chateau, but they made sure every summer that they ran a summer camp for underprivileged children. So they already had dormitories, arrangements for feeding for the summer camp that they ran. And as things got worse and worse during the war, and more children were orphaned and had nowhere to live, they opened up their chateau, their home, for orphans, mostly non-Jewish orphans. And amongst the war orphans, Jewish children were hidden with a false identity, and everybody thought these Jewish children were Catholics. So this was articles in a magazine that showed what life was like when it was run as a summer school. This is the building that Willy slept in, and when we were there, the prince explained that if he can find the funding, he would like to turn that into a Holocaust museum, specifically aimed at telling the story of hidden children. We went on a tour, and they've kept it as much as they can. That's the small children's bathroom, and Willy, always with a sense of humour, looked at that and came in and said, "Oh, I thought they were bigger," because obviously he was a child at the time. The prince and his family were very hospitable. They treated us to lunch, and the top left-hand photo is the princess and the prince. And one of the prince's treasured possessions is the award that he achieved on behalf of his grandfather from Yad Vashem, of his grandfather being a righteous Gentile, because he risked his life to save Jews during the Holocaust. And the prince decided not to be a bystander. He decided not to collaborate as the mayor, the civil service, and the police were collaborating. He and others took great risks by taking a stand. Here is the prince at the time. He had a university education. He was a working man. He worked in the diplomatic service. He was abroad. And in 1940, after the invasion of Belgium by the Germans, Prince Eugene returned to the chateau and joined the Belgian resistance. And he and his wife hid Jewish children, putting his whole family's life at risk. Quite an amazing man. After the Second World War, he was appointed ambassador of Belgium in India and then to Spain. So after we had lunch, we were taken into the private quarters, and I think it's going to be the only time in my life where I was served coffee and chocolates by a princess. And we were shown a DVD that the prince had made interviewing hidden children who were hidden in the chateau between 1940 and 1944, because he wanted to make sure that this was not forgotten. Now, Willy explained that suddenly he and some other children were told to pack their bags. They were going to another school. Now, Willy didn't know that there were other Jewish children in the school. None of the children did. But it turns out that the reason that Willy and these other children were asked to suddenly move is that one of the Jewish children's mothers had discovered where they were and had made a visit, which put everybody's lives at risk. So these children were suddenly taken away to somewhere else. And Willy knew that it was in a town called Mechelen, but he didn't know where in Mechelen it was. He had looked on the internet, and from photos, he thought it was a place called Caritas. And on the right, you can see the map where the chateau is, and further north is where Mechelen is. So we visited Caritas. We had an appointment. We met the person in charge. We were shown round, and Willy said, "I'm sorry, this isn't the place." And the our host said, well, as it happens, I know the archivist of Mel. So he phoned him up and said, we have somebody here who's a hidden child and is trying to find out where he stayed. Can we come over and see if you can help? So we jumped in their car. They were, I say, very hospitable, and we met the local archivist. And the archivist had got on his screen photographs of likely places. And he went through the photos, and suddenly Willy said, I know that place. That is the dormitory that I stayed in. And from then on, we knew that Willy lived in Mel College. Well, Mel College is one of the top schools in Belgium. Think of Harrow, think of Eton. And we then jumped in the car of our host and we were taken to Mel College. They had a phone call to say that we were on the way and was that okay? But the visit was not planned and we were very warmly welcomed there. We had a tour around and there's a picture on the left of the dormitory as Willy remembers it. And on the right, you can see how it is today as an art studio. Then we walked into the chapel and on the left is from the archivist how it was about wartime, and on the right is how it is today. And there's Willy, and the man he's talking to is the principal of the school. And as I say, this visit was not at all planned. And we went into the chapel, and at the end of the chapel, there were a group of children preparing for their first communion. And the teacher, being a very sensible teacher who was preparing these children to perform in front of an audience, saw that she had a small audience that the children could practice to. So we were given the treat of hearing these children sing. We're going to see a small recording of that now. And one of the things that was particularly poignant is that Willy had explained to me that he was so sad throughout the whole of his time as a hidden child. He was suddenly taken away from his family, taken away from his Jewish life, had to pretend to be somebody else, as he was 9 years old when he started. And the only pleasure that he got was singing as a boy soprano in the chapel. And he was brought up listening to classical music and he appreciated that. And so it was particularly moving when he came into the chapel and heard the children sing. And if the technology works, hopefully you'll be able to hear them too. Okay, so you can see Willy is on the right, and he was very moved, very moved. And the teacher, after the children had sung, explained to the children in an age-appropriate way that Willy was, Willy had been there when he was a child. I don't speak Flemish, so I don't know exactly what she said, but she asked the children if they had any questions for Willy. And so this was in Flemish. So they asked Willy questions, and Willy hadn't spoken Flemish since he was a teenager. And quite amazingly, he suddenly started speaking Flemish, answering their questions. Quite amazing. Now, one of the things I'd like you to notice here and remember for a photo I'm going to show you later is what the children look like, in that they are mostly blonde haired. And why I'm asking you to remember that will become clear later on. So there we were at the school. The principal was fantastic, very hospitable, and was very interested in Willy and finding out about Willy's experiences during the war. And we wanted to see what records there were of Willy on the registration books of during the war. So this chap, fantastic, he went to the archives and got the records out of the children who were registered during the war. And we were looking for Willy's name, and we were looking for the two brothers that Willy had met in the United States that were also hidden in this school. And we looked and we looked, and we discovered that Willy's name was not on the register, and neither were the names of the two brothers in the States. And in our discussions with other people at museums and archives later on, we discovered why that was. That the Nazis knew that there were Jewish children being hidden, and they wanted to find them. And so they, on lots of schools all over the place, they would go and do an audit at no notice. And so they would compare the records of the registration records and exam records. Because what the schools did do is they did enter the Jewish children along with all the other children for public exams. Because remember, as far as all the other children were concerned, these were Catholic kids, not Jewish children. And it turns out that what schools did is when they got the exam results, they burnt the exam results so that there wouldn't be a record for an audit check by the Nazis or the Belgian civil service collaborators and the Belgian police who collaborated. So we found out what happened to Willy. We found out which schools he was in. And then we continued our research to find out what happened to Willy's parents. And Willy had done the most amazing job of organizing 2 weeks of visits to archives. And here is a list of the places we went to. Obviously, looking through these records, Willy found it very upsetting because the records were incredibly detailed of what happened to his parents, his aunts, uncles, and cousins. We were able to see and touch the original registration documents. And at the top right hand of this screen, you'll see the poster that told Jews they had to register. And we were shown the registration cards that Willy's parents had stamped with Jew. You can see Willy's father and mother, and at the bottom left hand on the reverse side of Willy's father's card are the names of the children. It was quite chilling. When the Jews were rounded up, they were taken to this place called Mechelen, which used to be an army fort. It was chosen to take the Jews to because it was next to a railway station. This picture shows on the left, photograph, I assume, taken by the Nazis of one roundup in 1942, and on the right, it's a photograph of people arriving who had been rounded up and were taken to this dreadful place, where the people who were taken there were treated in the most appalling way. And I'm going to read something to you, which is about how the Belgian mayor a Belgian mayor today is apologising for the collaboration of the mayor, the civil service and the police at the time. At the 70th anniversary remembrance ceremony in Belgium of the first 1942 police orchestrated premeditated manhunts that rounded up Jews in Antwerp, Mayor Patrick Janssens said that the city authorities at the time had lacked responsibility, courage, force, and moral compass. And as I've said before, that I was really shocked at the level of collaboration that took place by the police, local government, and the railway system. From here, they were taken in cattle cars to Auschwitz Death Camp. On the left is a cattle car that did that run, and the wall behind it is the museum that has been built next to the Mechelen fort that is still there today. On the right, you see people arriving at Auschwitz. I don't know where these poor people are coming from. And on arrival at Auschwitz for the Belgians, 2/3 went straight to be gassed. The civil servants, the Belgian police and the Nazis kept incredible records. And they kept records of all of the transports that went from Mechelen to Auschwitz. And we looked at the lists, and we can see, and I've done it in colours, in Transport 7 was the one Willy's dad was in. Transport 25 was the one Willy's mum was in. So Willy's mum almost survived the war. And if you've got the transport number, the date, the number of men, the number of boys, the number of women, the number of girls, and the total. And you can see the totals are around 1,000 because each train load took 1,000. So they would round people up, keep them there in the most dreadful conditions. And when they had 1,000, they'd put them on a train. Now, between Transport 23 and 24 towards the bottom, there is another transport, Transport Z. And Transport Z stands for Zigeuner. In German means Roma or Gypsy. And there was a roundup of Roma or Gypsies. They were treated dreadfully as well. They were put in the top floor where they were given no food, water, had no sanitation at all. And then they were taken off in the train to Auschwitz as well. All in all, there were 25,267 people. And the records were just chillingly exact. The museum next door, Caserne d'Ossun, is a modern museum, and it's the Belgian Holocaust Museum. And we went in there. The building is 4 floors tall, and the walls are covered in photographs of the Jewish men, women, and children who were taken away. And those that are in sepia survived, and those who were grey perished. Willy went in this museum with me, and what I hadn't realised is that this was the first Holocaust museum Willy had ever been in. He explained that he just didn't have the moral and emotional strength to go into a museum, a Holocaust museum, or to attend a Holocaust memorial event. He just couldn't do it. We were able to see photos of Willy's family, find out what happened to them. He came from a big family, and the vast majority were murdered by the Nazis. In the museum, they had some powerful images. This is one. This is not one of Willy's family, but this is the ID card that people carried with them, and that had the word Jew stamped on it. While they were waiting it to be taken away, the Jews were publicly humiliated. This is some men who were being humiliated in the barracks. And this is men from convoy number 8, which is the convoy after Willy's father went. Another picture of Jews being publicly humiliated. And these are pictures that I took inside the museum. The Belgians were being very open, and they wanted the story to be told today. So we had this very full program of visiting museums and archives during the week. On Sunday, the museums and archives were closed. So we decided to go and visit the houses where Willy's family lived. He had the addresses, and you can see Willy standing outside these addresses, and the Jewish people had their homes confiscated from them. And Willy has been unable to find any documentation to prove that these houses actually should belong to him. And that was quite an emotionally draining experience. We did that in the morning, and it was lunchtime. It was a pleasant day, and we brought packed lunch. So we thought, let's have a bit of relaxation. Let's find a local park and go and have our lunch in the local park. So I got out my phone and went on Google Maps and says, take us to a nearest park. So it took us to the Stutz Park. And Willy walked in and said, oh my goodness, this is the park that I used to come with my scooter, where the photograph was taken of my parents, my aunt, and my sisters. So I have to say, far from it being a relaxing park visit, it was actually really quite upsetting for Willy. This photo was the only photo Willy had of his parents. He didn't have it when he went into hiding. Fortunately, one of his sisters, who also went into hiding, took this photo with her. It's only a very small photo. And this was the only photo Willy had of his parents, until we went to one of the archives, the Felix archive. And this is where the ID cards were kept, the original copies of the ID cards. Now, these ID cards, they were originally taken and given to all people when they arrived in the country. So Willy's parents arrived from France looking for business opportunities, and this is in the 1930s when things were fine, and everybody had an ID card. And so you can tell by looking at the photos that people took a lot of care over what they looked like. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the ladies went to the hairdressers and men dressed in their nice suit to have their photo taken. But these are tiny passport-sized photos. And this wonderful archivist very kindly scanned each of these tiny photos and presented Willy with the first portraits he had of his parents. Very, very nice of her, because the regulations say that they're not really supposed to do that, but she was really, really good. And that meant a great deal to Willy. So on our visit, we met other hidden children and a member of the Belgian resistance. We met a very interesting man who was a hidden child. His name is Marcel Friedman, and he is a psychologist, and he has written a book about the traumatic effects of being a hidden child. So by talking to him, the career path he had taken and the professional publications that he has made, it's very clear that the trauma that he lived through has stayed with him all his life. We also met Regina Schlusny, a lovely, lovely person. And she too has written a book about her time as a hidden child. And Regina goes into schools to tell school children about her time as a hidden child. And she explained to us that she always starts off by saying, I had a good war. And then she explains why. She was a very small child, when her parents gave her up to go into hiding. And so the Catholic family that she was brought up in, she actually thought was her real family. After the war, she was reunited with her birth mother, who was her mother. And her mother had had a most traumatic experience. She was hidden in different places in Belgium, in 15 different places, some dreadful places, and she had to flee from one place to another as rumors went round that people knew where she was. So her mother was permanently mentally damaged. And when this lady, Regina's mother, took her to look after her again, it didn't work out very well. Regina's, for example, Regina's mother was brought up in a strictly kosher home. Regina's Catholic family obviously did not keep a kosher home. So when Regina asked for a glass of milk with a meat meal, her mother had a major trauma about it and made Regina's life very, very difficult. And Regina explained that eventually she spent some of the week with her real mother and some of the week with the family that looked after her during the war. And as an adult, she considers that branch of her family who looked after her during the war to be a legitimate part of her family. They saved her life. Now, the other person we met was Andre Gerlin Herzevici. And this is the amazing lady who I found out about on that first night when I did the internet search. And the lady who was part of the resistance, who hid thousands of Jewish children. And here's some more pictures of the books I told you about that had the different codes with just the numbers. And the first photo I showed earlier on showed a Kiba Halpert with the number 1652. And at the bottom left hand, you can see Willy van Hammer 1652. And in the center, there is a picture of Andre Gerlin with some of the children that she hid that was taken just after the war when they were being looked after. So we tried to get an appointment to meet Andre Gerlin Herzevici, and Regina Schlusny knew her and arranged for us to go to her flat. We spent a couple of hours there, and Willy was able to thank her for saving his life. And remember, Willy, he did not know anything about her. He thought the person who had saved his life and put him into hiding was the man who took him away when his dad was arrested in the street. Now, Andre Gerlin Herzevici, she's currently 99 years old. When she was 90, one of the hidden children wrote a song in honor of her for her 90th birthday. And before that, this marvelous lady was given the honor of being a righteous Gentile and went to Jerusalem, went to Yad Vashem, and was awarded the righteous Gentile. So I'm going to show you a video clip now of the song that was written in her honor, written, as I say, by a hidden child. It's in Hebrew. There are English subtitles, and you'll see the ceremony where she was presented with her Righteous Gentile Award, and all of the adults surrounding her are hidden children whose lives she saved. And this is the video that I mentioned that starts off without sound, and there won't be any sound until you see somebody playing the keyboard.
ובקול גבוה הם דרשו להפריד בין ילדים נוצרים ליהודים. היא ניסתה לעצור באדם ילדים הם עדיין, אז ניגש המפקד עם השוט ונבח בנזיפה. איך בלונדינית יפה שכמותך תכולת עיניים, מנסה להציל תולעים ושרצים משרפה, אבל היא הזדקפה ואיתה כל 20 אביביה. איך אתם בני העם הדוגל בשירה ותרבות מצליפים בלעדים החפים מכל פשע, ובחוץ ממתינה משאית כי דינם הוא למות. את לא מפחדת? שאלו אותה הידידי. אני בת 20 ענתה, ובגיל 20 לא מפחדים. היא הייתה בת 20, מדריכת ילדים מבריסל. הילדים קראו לה מדמואזל. כששמעה שבחוץ המשאית העמוסה מתרחקת, היא ידעה, הם יבואו שנית, להמשיך במלאכה. ומדלת לדלת עברה, ובשקט בשקט לחשה, להכין מזוודונת, דובון ושמיכה. ולמחרת היא חזרה ואספה ילדים חרש חרש. יוצאים לטיול אל היער, בשקט, בסוד, ללטף אבזים ושפנים. והאם החיוורת שידעה נפנפה לילדים בחיוך של דמעות. מדמואזל אנדרה הובילה אותם יד ביד, על גבה, מתגנבת, לעתים בעגלה עם חציר שלבד דחפה. חיילים גרמניים, על פניהם ללא פחד חולפת, הם שלחו לה קריצה, היא הייתה באמת כה יפה. את לא מפחדת? שאלו אותה הידידים. אני בת 20 ענתה, ובגיל 20 לא מפחדים. היא הייתה בת 20, מצילת הילדים מבריסל. הילדים קראו לה מדמואזל. חדש ואוהב, ותפילות חדשות ואסור שיכירו חלילה, שם בחוץ שעצוב, שלבד שכואב, והרבה אנשים אמיצים בביתם אז הסתירו, תוך סיכון חייהם מול גסטאפו, מול כל הזוועות, ילדים שניצלו, שלנכד יזכירו, ילדים ללא צל שלמדו איך בוכים בלי דמעות. את לא מפחדת? שאלו אותה הילדים. אני בת 20 עלתה, ובגיל 20 לא מפחדים. היא הייתה בת 20, צעירה ניצה מבריסל. היא היום בת 90, אך תמיד תישאר.
Quite an amazing, amazing woman. And here she is, 99 years old in September 2020. Looking great. So back to our trip in Belgium. As it happens, and it was just pure coincidence, our trip to Belgium coincided with Yom HaShoah. And we went to 2 events. And as I said, Willy had never been to a Holocaust memorial event before. And the first one we went to was at the National Museum for Jewish Martyrs who were killed during the war. And you can see Willy bottom right, and he was given pride of place in a special section for hidden children. Now, Willy's parents were murdered in Auschwitz. They don't have a grave. And what we saw after the ceremony is that the walls surrounding this memorial are like giant tombstones. And inscribed in the tombstones are the names of all of the over 25,000 people who died. And we found the names of Willy's family, and there's a picture of that. So when we're in Antwerp, we were also invited to a Holocaust memorial ceremony. And in the bottom, you can see the Jewish choir that sung Jewish children there. And if you remember early on, when we looked at the children singing in the Mel Chapel, I asked you to remember that they were mostly blonde. Well, if you look at these children, they are mostly dark-haired. And it made me wonder how difficult it was to hide Jewish children within the Belgian population. So, what happened after the war? Well, it wasn't an easy ride for Willy at all. He was liberated when he was at school in Belgium, but as he was a French citizen, he was then obliged to go to France. So he spent over a year living in a residential school. I don't think much happened there, while the Red Cross tried to locate members of his family. He was reunited with his sisters. You can see in the photo that the photo has 2 sisters. What Willy didn't know is that when Willy's dad was taken away, his mother was expecting another child. So there were 3 sisters he was reunited with. And they also found an uncle who had survived, who went to Australia. What Willy discovered subsequently is that another uncle had survived, came back to Belgium, thought that all of the family had been wiped out. And so tragically, this uncle committed suicide. So Willy and his sisters, Willy was 14 at this point, was sent to Australia. And when he got there, it was clear that the uncle's home was not big enough to take Willy and his 3 sisters. And so they were put in an orphanage, not a very happy time at all. And Willy, being the eldest, not very old, he explained to me that he had to take on the role of father figure, and he had to learn another language. So he already spoke Yiddish and Flemish and French. So then he learned English. And so he got at 14, learned English, ended up getting qualifications to enter university, got a degree in engineering, and got a job in engineering. And he then became interested in Israel, and he decided to make Aliyah. So he then went to Israel and had to learn another language. So he learned Hebrew. He worked in various places. He was in the Navy in special operations, and he is not allowed to talk about what he did in special operations. And he had an interest in diving. So he went to Eilat, before Eilat was a resort and before there was diving, and he set up the first diving school on the beach in Eilat. And there's a photograph of Willy. Here's the person facing you, and he's teaching a class scuba diving. He turned that little hut on the beach into a very successful scuba diving school called Aquasport. And so if you ever go to Eilat, or you've been to Eilat and you've seen Aquasport, Willy started that up. He sold the business a long time ago now. In Israel, he met Marilyn, and Marilyn was the music librarian to the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra, and they married, and they have 2 sons. And when Marilyn and Willy retired, they decided that they were going to go and live in Canada, which is where Marilyn's family come from and where Marilyn's mother at the time was still living. So there is a recent photo of Marilyn, Willy, and their sons Lauren and Daniel. And you can see Willy's looking pretty well. He has a fantastically positive attitude on life. He enjoys traveling. He's taken up painting. He gives talks about his life and the Holocaust. And if you hear Willy's talk, you'll see that it bears quite a strong resemblance to mine because we prepared it together. I say he does painting. This is a painting he did for us. In fact, it's hanging up in our bedroom. He's a fantastic artist. If you would like to hear Willy tell his own story, as I say, you'll see a lot of similarity to mine. You can see it on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website, and it's there so that it's testimony that this really happened and nobody can deny it happened. And that is the end of my presentation. So if anybody has any questions, that would be great. I will stop the screen share, and now I can see you all. And I'm going to have a